Hello, everyone. This is Patrick, and I hope you're doing well today. We're now on our fifth person study throughout the Bible, and today we're going to be looking at Peter, primarily in the book of Matthew, if you'd like to turn there. While you do, I'll give a brief introduction. In preparation for this study, I asked several people what their first thought was concerning Peter. From my small sample size, there is a common theme. People usually remember two things about Peter at first glance: walking on water and denying Jesus 3 times. These moments stand out because of Peter's lack of faith or his denying Jesus. While these are pivotal moments in his life, hopefully you will take something new from this lesson. Peter was born Simon and came from a village called Bethsaida in Galilee. For those interested, Galilee is located in northern Israel on the bank of the Sea of Galilee, also called Lake Tiberias on most modern maps. Another personal fact about Peter was that he was a married man. 3 of the gospel writers mention this, but our reference is Matthew 8, verses 14 through 15, where Jesus heals Peter's mother-in-law of a fever. We also know his wife was a part of his ministry, referencing 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 5. But the most well-known fact about Peter's personal life was that he was a fisherman. This is where we find him when he meets Jesus. The story is found in Matthew chapter 4, but I'll expand on the version found in Luke 5, verses 1 through 11. Here, Peter and his crew were trying to catch fish, but had not been successful. Jesus then calls out to them to try the other side, and they catch so many fish, it almost sinks not just Peter's boat, but also another boat that tries to help them out. After witnessing this event, Peter then falls down and confesses that he is a sinful man before Jesus, also referring to Jesus as Lord. Jesus calls Peter and his brother Andrew to be a fisher of men, to which they answer the call and leave everything behind them. Now Peter becomes a member of what I and many others call the Inner 12. Jesus had many followers, but the Inner 12 are his innermost circle of disciples. That is well known, but I just wanted to give context as we skip to chapter 14 in Matthew. In Matthew 14, Peter walks on water with Jesus. As we recently did a study with the youth group about this, I'll be brief in my summary. During a rough storm, the disciples see Jesus and they think it's a ghost. Peter calls out to find that it is in fact Jesus, and in turn, Jesus calls him to walk on the water with him. Peter does this until he looks at the storm and begins to sink. Jesus saves him and talks about his lack of faith. Many stop Peter's study there and skip to where he denies Jesus, but Matthew 16 is a great chapter too. It is in chapter 16 where we get today's passage, as I feel it describes Peter perfectly. This section is often referred to as Peter's statement of faith. Specifically in Matthew 16, I'll be reading verses 13 through 16, and here we go. Now when Jesus came into the district of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, "Who do the people say that the Son of Man is?" And they said, "Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and others Jeremiah or one of the prophets." He said to them, "But who do you say that I am?" Simon Peter replied, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." What a powerful statement. It is in the following verses where Jesus says that answer was divine in nature and gives Peter his new name, meaning rock. Now before we stop, let's read verses 21 through 23. And now verse 21. From that time Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the elders and chief priests and scribes, and be killed, and on the 3rd day be raised. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him, saying, "Far be it from you, Lord, this shall never happen to you." But he turned and said to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan. You are a hindrance to me, for you are not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man." I often find it interesting that many people think this was said to Satan himself, but it's actually said to Peter. The reason that this is important is right after an amazing statement of faith, he argues with Jesus because he doesn't understand the divine nature of God's plan. How many of us have done the same? Continuing with this theme, let's go on to chapter 17. Here we find Peter, James, and John going up with Jesus alone, and they see him transfigured into glory alongside Moses and Elijah. Peter speaks up and mentions pitching tents for the 3 of them. Unfortunately, Peter is still focusing on the wrong earthly things rather than purely on the eternal. And now let's skip ahead to chapter 26, verses 30 through 35, where we start to see the fall of Peter. This is where Peter and the other disciples all say that they never betrayed Jesus and would die for him. Jesus then predicts Peter's betrayal. Continuing this story, Peter's night gets even darker. He and the 12 accompany Jesus to Gethsemane, and he is selected alongside John and James to pray close to Jesus. 3 times, Jesus finds them asleep and says to them, "For the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak." Now, before any of us go on to criticize the disciples, they'd been up for 3 days now. Many of us would have done the same. It is after this point, Jesus is arrested and Peter infamously cuts off the servant's ear. I won't go too much into detail other than Peter is still relying on his flesh. Peter then follows the group who arrested Jesus and goes to the inner court found in chapter 26, verses 69 through 75. It is here Peter says, "I do not know him." Reading the Greek, this translates not just as denying, but Peter literally is saying that he doesn't know Jesus even exists. He is comparing him to a complete and total stranger. Here I'm going to briefly pause. This is Peter's lowest point, and for many, this is Peter's most defining moment. But while we pause, let's look at ourselves. We all think that we'd never do such a thing, but how many of us shy away from saying we're a Christian at school or at work? How many of us turn down the radio when a Christian song is on with the windows down in our car? Or how many of us get nervous to pray at a public restaurant or with friends because we feel that it will be different? Maybe it's just me and I'm condemning myself, but the point is, while Peter is in the wrong, we are not above making mistakes ourselves with a lot less on the line. But let's keep going now, because the story gets brighter from here on out. It's now the first Easter morning. In John chapter 20, verses 1 through 6, the disciples are told by the two Marys about the empty tomb. Peter and John race there, and being John's gospel, he lets us know that he got there first. Here's where Peter begins to change. See, John gets to the tomb first and sees that the tomb is empty. The Greek word used is vlepo, meaning to see, like you see this video or you see your phone across the room. Peter also goes in and sees the empty tomb, but the Greek word used here is theoreo, which is where we get our word theory. It could be said that Peter perceived the empty tomb, and he now understands the meaning that Jesus is alive. In John 21, verses 15 through 19, Jesus questions Peter's love 3 times, which parallels the 3 denials. It is a powerful and moving chapter, and I recommend you read it yourself. But what's important here is that Peter is forgiven and redeems himself. Peter's story in the Bible doesn't end in the Gospels. He helps lead the church in the book of Acts and gives sermons on the power of Jesus' ministry and the importance of the death and resurrection. He also performs miracles during this time, and it's because of these things that something prominent and spectacular happens. In Acts chapter 4, Peter and John are brought before the Jewish religious leaders. These are the very same people that condemned Jesus, and it likely takes place in the exact spot where Peter denied Jesus. They are asked not to perform miracles and to stop their preaching, to which they say no and speak with authority. The passage goes on to say that the council could do nothing because the people were on the disciples' side. This passage also gives me 3 quick notes for us to think about. First is what an awesome change in Peter. Second, this also shows that Jesus was laying down his life at his trials, whereas the disciples are now coming with the power that he laid aside. And third, and an interesting fact, the council doesn't deny the resurrection. There is no argument because it is true. All they could do was threaten the disciples, not their theology, which I think is an interesting point. Under the apostles, Peter and the others grow the early church. Even though he has a few disagreements with Paul, this is soon laid aside. He then writes 1st and 2nd Peter, which describe our living hope, how to live as Christians, and what to watch out for. This concludes Peter's life in the Scriptures. According to sources and tradition, it is believed Peter was martyred along with his family in 67 or 68 AD in Rome. It is believed he was crucified, referencing John 21:18 through 19, but also referenced in 2 Peter 1:14. Additional sources say that he was crucified upside down. While this is a sad death for Peter, I can tell you where he is right now. Now, looking at the total of Peter's life leads me to one major application for all of us. Jesus sees us not for who we are, or for our past, but for who we will become. Back in Matthew 16, Jesus named Simon Peter, knowing that he'd mess up. Some of you may feel ashamed of your past or even your present. You may feel like Peter at the temple, defeated or compromised. Just know that it's never too late to come back or to start fresh. See, Satan wants you to look back at your past and your sin and let that stop you from moving ahead. But that's a lie. You are not defined by your failures, rather by your faith in Christ and his forgiveness. That is the story of Peter. Not one defined by failure, but of faith and forgiveness. That message should encourage all of us. That's what Jesus sees when he looks at you. Not for what you were or for what you are, but for what you could be. It's the greatest threat to the enemy, which is why it's so often under attack. But our God and his grace are mightier than the enemy. Neither you nor I have any standing before God except by Jesus' sacrifice. That's all that matters, because it's all sufficient. No failure is too great or sin too big that it's beyond God's forgiveness. What an amazing and freeing message. Thank you all for listening. Next week we'll conclude our biblical figure study, and I won't say who the person is, but their name appears in the Old and New Testament. I hope you have a great day, a wonderful weekend, and God bless.